Hey everyone, and welcome to your C# tutorial on encapsulation. As you can see, I have Visual Studio pulled up and the boilerplate code ready to go. So to begin this discussion on encapsulation, let's start with the definition. So a lot of people and a lot of programmers have different definitions of encapsulation. So I'm going to give you Microsoft's definition of encapsulation, and then I'm going to kind of expand on it with my own definition. So the Msdn encapsulation definition is: encapsulation means hiding the unnecessary details from type consumers. And what they mean by type consumer is anybody who's using the class that you make. And this is a good definition, but it's also a little bit vague. What I'd like to do is maybe provide a more thorough definition. And so I'd like to say that encapsulation is binding together data and functionality so that unnecessary details are hidden. It's very similar to the Msdn documentation, but I just wanted to point out that frequently with encapsulation, you're binding together data and functionality. Right? I think that that's a key distinction or a key detail that I'd like to add to the definition. So let's kind of see how this works. Let's create a class, and we can call it bank account. Now, previously in bank account, we had a public variable to represent our balance. So before we used an integer, let's use a double now. We'll say public double, and we'll call it balance. So this is not a great example of encapsulation because our balance is public. So our data is available to anybody who wants to come and grab it and change it and use it for whatever they want. So as we see, encapsulation means hiding unnecessary details from type consumers. And a lot of times, some of these details could be damaging to us if they get revealed. So to solve this issue of a public balance variable, we can bind together some functionality, or bind some functionality together with our data here to make sure that it's hidden. And we can do that through two general methods, and those are getters and setters. Let's start by defining what a getter is. A getter is a method and a function of the class that provides the value of a member variable. So now you might be thinking, well, if we're just going to provide the value of the member variable anyway, why don't we just make the member variable public? Well, when you provide the value of a variable, you're not allowing a user to also change that variable. So for example, if we create a bank account object and we call it account, set this to new bank account, we can access in our account the balance, and we can set it to, whatever we want here. We can set it to $100, or we can set it to $0. A getter does not let you do that. A getter just provides the value. It doesn't let you change the value. Once it provides the value, you actually never had access to the actual variable itself. You only had access to the value of the variable. So let's write a quick getter, and we can see how this is different. So to make a getter, let's make our balance private. And we should see that we can no longer access this balance on our account object. So what we can do is we can create a public method that will return a double because it's going to return the value of our member variable balance, and we will call it get balance. So calling a getter get and then the member variable name is very common. That's kind of the naming convention around getters. So whenever you create a getter, it's a good idea to call it get and then the member variable name. So what we can do here is we can just return balance. So now how is this different from just having a public balance member variable? Well, it's different because we're not giving them access to the balance object. We are giving them the value. They can't actually change that value. So they can never alter the data in this object because we're giving them a copy of it. When we return balance, we are not returning a reference to balance. We are returning the value of balance, and there's no reference back to the object. So when we had our bank account member variable exposed, you could set it to be something. But if we use our get balance object, we can't set that to be anything. You see, that doesn't work. It doesn't work because we're just providing a copy of the value. If you wanted to change the balance member variable, you'd have to have access to the member variable. Our getter is not giving access to the member variable. It is just giving a copy of the value of the member variable. So that's one reason you would want to use a getter. Another reason is, so we'll write why use a getter. And we'll say reason one, you cannot alter the value of the member variable. Reason two for why you would want to use a getter is you can manipulate the data of the member variable before you expose it to the public. So this is pretty useful because many times you're going to want to sometimes you're going to want to do some type of data manipulation or some type of check before you return a value. In our situation, what I'd like to do with our get balance getter is I would like to check, and I'll say if our balance is greater than or equal to 0, then we will return our balance. And if our balance is less than 0, so in our else block here, then we'll just return 0. So we're going to say that if you overdraft your bank account, it doesn't matter. We'll just return 0. So let's try this. We can, whenever we use our getter, our value needs to have, our member variable needs to have a value. So we're just going to give it the value of 100. And it's going to be inside the class. And maybe that's every new user of our bank gets a bank account balance of $300. And you can never overdraft. So this is a fantastic bank. So we'll create a double variable, and we will call it user balance. And we will set it to account.getBalance. So there it is. It works. Now we've provided the value of our member variable, but we haven't provided a reference to that member variable. So any user that comes along and wants to access our account data can get it, but they can't change it. The changing or the mutation of the variable comes with a setter. So what is a setter? A setter is a method that allows a user to mutate data inside the class. So we have our bank account class here, and we have our data here. Now we can create a setter, and we'll make this public, and we are going to have it be a void function. Setters are usually void. And the naming convention for a setter is set and then the variable name. So we'll call this one set balance. And whereas our getter took no parameters, our setter will take a parameter. And we will say our setter will take in a double, and we'll call our parameter balance input. And so let's open up our curly braces. And inside of our function here, our method, we'll say this dot, different language, balance equals balance input. Cool. So this is a basic setter. So now you might be asking yourself, well, if this is all a setter does, then why would we ever want to use a setter? Well, the reason to use a setter generally, so we'll write this, why use a setter. So a reason to use a setter would be one big reason, I really only have one reason here, is to validate or verify change data before that input mutates your member data. So a good reason to use a setter would be to validate data. So if we're taking an input in and we're going to store this in our bank account class, let's say that we don't want to take in negative numbers, right? Because our balance can never be below 0. We don't want to have a balance below 0. So we can say if the balance input, right, our balance input over here, if our balance input is greater than 0, we'll say greater than or equal to, so they can put 0 in as well, then we will have this dot balance equal input. And I'm going to say, I'm going to leave this without an else, so that if somebody enters in something silly like -50, then we just ignore it and we just keep going on. So this is an example of a setter and why you might want to use a setter. Okay, so let's see these setters and getters in action. We'll scroll up here and let's just get rid of this code. We'll probably recreate it in just a second, but let's just start fresh, and we'll start with a console.writeLine, and we're going to greet the user to our program. We'll say, welcome to Dream ATM, and we'll print out console.writeLine. We'll say, your current balance is, and we will create a bank account object, sorry, not a balance object, a bank account object called account. And we will set that equal to a new account. So we'll initialize a new bank account. So we'll initialize the object, and we'll new up an instance of the object. And we will create a variable called user balance, and we will set that to our current account balance, and we're going to use our getter for that. And then we will display that balance onto the screen. So we'll do a console.writeLine, and we will display to the user our user balance. And what I could do, instead of creating a variable here, I could just do our account.getBalance and paste it into there. And since this returns a value of a double, we could just plop it in here and it'll work fine. But for whatever reason, I just felt like creating a variable. Okay, so user will see their balance. Next, what we'll do is we'll say console.writeLine, and we will say, what is your dream balance? And so we're going to allow the user to set their dream balance of how much money they would like to have in their ATM. And to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to create a double, and this will be called dream balance. And we're going to set this equal to a console.readLine. So it's going to read in the user's input. And sorry, what's going on here? Console.readLine, yeah. And what we need to do is we need to add a double parse. And so what this is doing is this is actually a static method on the double class that allows us to take our console.readLine, which returns a string, and it converts it into a double. And so we'll store that double into our dream balance variable. And what we'll do is with our account object up here, create some space. With our account object, we will set our balance. And our balance will be set to our dream balance. So what that'll do is we'll take our dream balance double, which is the user input, and we'll call set balance on it. So if we go down, we see that set balance will change our dream balance. That'll take that value and put it into this balance input parameter. Inside of our scope, we'll use our balance input parameter, and if it's above 0 or equal to 0, then we will set our member variable balance to be equal to our balance input, which will represent our dream balance. Okay, so then after all that's done, we'll do a console.writeLine, and we will say your dream balance is now, and we will do a console.writeLine, and we will use we'll just use the account.getBalance from earlier, and we'll just paste it in here. And so our account will now store our dream balance. So let's run this. And I'm going to minimize this window so we can make room for our console window. We see a pop-up over here. Welcome to the Dream ATM. Your current balance is 100. What is your dream balance? And I'll say, I'm going to shoot pretty low. I'm going to say my dream balance is 125. I'm going to hit enter. And it says your dream balance is now 125. Perfect. So we see that our getters and our setters worked. Our getter is here. And we know that that's our balance from down here. And our setter worked because we see that with our account.getBalance, it's reflecting our dream balance. Awesome. Let's run it again. And let's see that the validation in our setter is working. So what is your dream balance? I will say negative 125. Your dream balance is now 100. Perfect. So if we go back to our setter, we see that if our balance input is less than 0, or if it's, if it is 0 or above, then we set our member variable of balance to our balance input. If it is not above 0, this if statement never runs and our balance stays the same, and that's reflected right here. So we can see that the validation that we're using in our setter is working. We're not taking in negative numbers. It's nobody's dream to be in debt. So that's how the validation aspect of the setter works. Awesome. So those are the basics of setters and getters. Setters and getters are also called mutators and accessors. So a getter would be an accessor, a setter would be a mutator. And both of them together kind of form the sort of like the very basic backbone of encapsulation. And so that's how encapsulation and accessors and mutators are connected, is through setters and getters. Awesome. So this has been your C# tutorial on encapsulation. I hope it's helped you understand this a little bit better. Thanks.